The letter arrived without a return address. Rémy Arceneaux had been a journalist in St. Martin Parish for 22 years. He had received anonymous tips before, accusations of corruption, rumors of affairs, the usual small-town scandals that people were too afraid to attach their names to. This was different. Inside the envelope was a hand-drawn map of the Atchafalaya Basin, the largest swamp in the United States. 14 X marks were scattered across the paper, each one labeled with a date from 1978. And beneath the map, a single sentence written in handwriting that trembled with age: "They weren't murdered, they were executed, and God help me, they deserved it." Rémy would spend the next 6 months learning what those words meant, learning about a family called Fontenot, learning about an airboat that was stolen on a spring night 39 years earlier, and learning that sometimes the men who disappear into the swamp aren't victims at all. Sometimes they're the monsters. The Atchafalaya Basin stretches across nearly 1 million acres of southern Louisiana, a labyrinth of bayous and cypress swamps and flooded forests that has swallowed men whole since before the first Europeans arrived. The Cajun people who settled here in the 18th century learned to navigate its waters, to harvest its crawfish and catfish, to trap its nutria and alligators, to make a living from a landscape that killed outsiders with casual indifference. The Fontenot family had been part of that landscape for 7 generations. They lived on a piece of high ground deep in the basin, accessible only by boat, a place that didn't appear on any official map, and that the family had occupied since 1847. They were trappeurs, trappers who harvested fur-bearing animals during the winter months, and guides who took wealthy hunters into the swamp for deer and duck and wild boar. They spoke French at home, English when necessary, and a silence that communicated more than either language when strangers asked too many questions. In March 1978, the family consisted of 6 men. Acelin Fontenot was the patriarch, 60 years old, a man who had been born in the basin and had never spent a night outside of it. His hair had gone white in his 40s, his hands had been scarred by decades of traps and knives, and his eyes carried the flat patience of someone who understood that the swamp operated on its own schedule and punished those who tried to rush it. His younger brother Thibault was 55, a quieter man who handled the business side of their operation, selling furs to buyers in Henderson, arranging hunting trips for clients from New Orleans and Baton Rouge, managing the money that allowed the family to maintain their isolation. Acelin's sons, Landry and Narcisse, were 50 and 45, respectively. Both had been raised in the old ways, had learned to pilot a boat before they could read, had killed their first alligator before their 10th birthdays. They were the muscle of the operation, the ones who did the hard physical work that their father and uncle were growing too old to handle. And then there were the grandsons, Alcide, 30 years old, Landry's son, and Gustave, 25, Narcisse's boy, the young ones. The future of the Fontenot family, assuming there was a future for men who lived the way their ancestors had lived in a world that was rapidly leaving such people behind. The airboat was central to everything they did. It was a 16-foot aluminum hull with a 454 Chevrolet engine mounted on the back, driving a wooden propeller that could push the craft across open water at 40 miles per hour, or through vegetation so thick that a conventional boat would have been trapped within seconds. Acelin had built it himself in 1969, had modified and improved it over the years until it was perfectly suited to the specific demands of the Atchafalaya. Without the airboat, the Fontenot operation couldn't function. The distances were too great, the terrain too difficult, the work too dependent on being able to reach places that no other vessel could access. The boat wasn't just property, it was survival itself, the difference between a family that could sustain itself and a family that would have to abandon the only life they had ever known. On the night of March 14th, 1978, someone stole it. Gustave discovered the theft at dawn. He had walked down to the dock where the airboat was always moored, carrying the gas cans that he would use to fill its tank before the day's work. The dock was empty. The ropes that should have secured the boat were lying in the water, cut cleanly rather than untied. He stood there for a long moment, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. The airboat was gone. Someone had come onto their land, their property, the place where Fontenots had lived for 130 years and had taken the most important thing they owned. He ran back to the main house, burst through the door, delivered the news in rapid French that his grandfather barely needed to hear. Aslan was already moving toward the window, already looking out at the dock, already processing the violation that had occurred while his family slept. "Who?" Landry asked, arriving from the cabin he shared with his wife. "Who would do this?" "Someone who knew what they were taking," Aslan replied. His voice was calm, but his sons recognized the tone, the quiet that preceded storms, the stillness that came before violence. Someone who knew the value and knew we couldn't chase them without a boat. "We have the pirogues," Narcisse said. "The small boats. We could—" "A pirogue against an airboat?" Aslan shook his head. "They're already miles away. Could be anywhere in the basin by now, or out of it entirely. Then we call the sheriff, report the theft, let the law handle it." Aslan turned to look at his younger son with an expression that mixed disappointment with something like pity. "The law doesn't come into the basin, boy. You know that. The law stays on the roads, in the towns where there are witnesses and paperwork and all the things that make their jobs easy. Out here, we are the law. We've always been the law. So what do? We find out who took it, we find out where they are, and then we handle it the way Fontenots have always handled people who steal from us." Thibault, who had been silent until now, spoke up from his chair by the window. "I might know who did this." All eyes turned to him. "There's been talk in Henderson, men from outside, coming into the basin at night. Not hunters, not fishermen, something else." "What kind of something else?" "The kind that doesn't want to be seen, the kind that uses the swamp to move things they don't want moved on roads." Thibault paused, his weathered face creased with thought. "I heard they've been looking for boats, fast boats, boats that can navigate the basin without getting stuck." "Who are they?" "Don't know names, but I know where they've been seen. Little island about 6 miles south of here. Place the old-timers used to call Île Maudite, Cursed Island. Nobody goes there. Too remote, too hard to reach. Perfect place for men who want to stay hidden." Aslan absorbed this information, his mind already working through possibilities and plans. "We need another boat before we can do anything. Gustave, take one of the pirogues and head to Bro's place. See if he'll loan us his flatboat until we can get ours back. And if he won't, tell him Asselin Fontenot is calling in the debt his father owed mine. He'll understand." Gustave nodded and headed for the door. He was young, but he had been raised to follow instructions from his elders without question. There would be time for questions later, after the immediate crisis was addressed. "The rest of you," Asselin continued, "we prepare, check the weapons, load the ammunition. If these men are what Thibault thinks they are, they won't give up our boat without a fight." "And if they fight?" Alcide asked. Asselin looked at his oldest grandson, at the young man who would someday lead this family if there was still a family left to lead. "Then we make sure they lose." Rémy Arceneaux read the letter 3 more times before deciding what to do with it. He was 54 years old in 2017, a veteran of Louisiana journalism who had covered hurricanes and oil spills and political scandals. He had won awards for his investigative work, had built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with sensitive information, had earned the respect of sources across South Louisiana, who knew that Rémy would protect them even when protection was costly. The letter had arrived at his home, not his office. Someone knew where he lived, knew his routines, had taken the trouble to research him before making contact. That suggested planning, intention. A source who wanted to tell a story, but wanted to control how it was told. The map was hand-drawn, but accurate. Rémy recognized the geography of the Atchafalaya, could identify specific features: Henderson Lake, the Whiskey Bay Pilot Channel, the network of bayous that most people couldn't navigate without GPS. Whoever had drawn this map knew the basin intimately, knew it the way only a native could know it, and the 14 X marks, each labeled with a date from 1978. Rémy did what any good journalist would do. He started researching. The archives of the St. Martin Parish Library contained newspapers from 1978. Microfilm that Rémy scrolled through, looking for any mention of disappearances, deaths, or unusual events in the Atchafalaya Basin. What he found was fragmentary but intriguing. April the 2nd, 1978. A brief mention that a man named Dewey Trosclair, a resident of New Iberia, had been reported missing by his employer, last seen heading toward the basin. April 19th, 1978. Another missing person, a Lafayette man named Corbett Hebert, who had failed to return from a fishing trip in the swamp. May the 8th, 1978. Two men, brothers from Texas named Garland and Wesson Crockett, reported missing after entering the Atchafalaya on what they described as a business trip. The pattern continued through the summer and into the fall. Isolated disappearances, men who went into the basin and never came out, cases that were investigated briefly and then closed without resolution. The swamp swallowed people every year. It was simply the nature of the place. Search and rescue could only do so much in 1,000,000 acres of wilderness. But 14 disappearances in 8 months, all in the same general area? All men who, according to the sparse reports, had no apparent connection to each other? That wasn't the swamp being hungry. That was something else. Rémy made a list of the dates on the map and compared them to the disappearances he had found. They matched. Every X mark corresponded to a reported missing person within a day or two of the labeled date. Someone was telling him where 14 men had been killed. And they were telling him that it wasn't murder. It was execution. The investigation into the stolen airboat began the day after the theft. Gustave returned from Bro's place with a 16-foot flatboat and a gas-powered outboard motor. Slower than the airboat, less maneuverable, but capable of reaching parts of the basin that a pirogue couldn't access efficiently. It wasn't ideal, but it would serve until they recovered what had been taken. Thibault made inquiries through his network of contacts, the informal economy of the basin, trappers and fishermen and hunters who traded information as readily as they traded furs and fish. Within 2 days, he had confirmation. Men had been seen on Île Maudite, men who weren't local, men who had arrived with equipment and supplies that suggested they planned to stay for a while, and they had an airboat, a 16-foot aluminum hull with a distinctive engine configuration that matched the description of the Fontenot boat exactly. "That's it," Thibault reported to the family. "That's our boat. They're using it to move between the island and somewhere else, probably a pickup point near the highway." "How many men?" Arceneaux asked. "The reports vary, at least 6, maybe as many as 10. And they're armed, pistols, shotguns, maybe rifles." "What are they moving?" Thibault hesitated. This was the part of his report that he had been dreading, the information that would transform a simple theft recovery into something much more complicated. "People," he finally said. "They're moving people, women and children mostly, bringing them through the basin to avoid the roads, avoid the checkpoints, avoid anyone who might ask questions." The room went silent. Human trafficking wasn't something the Fontenot family had ever encountered directly, but they knew it existed, knew that the remote waterways of Louisiana had been used by smugglers of various kinds for centuries. The basin was a perfect corridor for anyone who wanted to move things or people without official scrutiny. "You're saying the men who stole our boat are traffickers," Landry said. "I'm saying that's what it looks like, which means recovering our property isn't just about a boat anymore. If we go after these men, we're walking into something bigger than a theft." "So we walk away?" Narcisse asked. "We let them keep what they stole because we're afraid of what they're doing." "I didn't say we walk away. I said we need to understand what we're dealing with." Aicelin had been listening without speaking, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 6 decades of surviving in a place that forgave no mistakes. "How many people? The ones they're moving?" "Don't know exactly, but the report suggests they've been doing this for months, maybe longer. Could be dozens, could be more." "Where do they take them?" "Somewhere outside the basin, Texas probably. There's demand there for workers who don't have papers, who won't complain, who can be controlled." Aicelin nodded slowly, processing information that had transformed a personal grievance into something that touched on questions of morality he had never expected to face. "They stole from us," he said finally. "That's the starting point. They came onto our land, took our property, violated the home we've held for 7 generations. For that alone, they deserve what's coming." "But," Thibault prompted, sensing there was more. "But if what you're saying is true, if they're holding people against their will, moving them like cargo..." Aicelin's eyes found each of his sons, his grandsons, his brother. "Then taking back our boat isn't enough. We can't just recover our property and leave the rest. We can't know what we know and do nothing." "What are you saying, Papa?" Landry asked. "I'm saying we don't just take back the boat. We take down the whole operation, every man involved, every piece of equipment, every connection they have to the outside world. We wipe them out, and we free whoever they're holding. That's not recovering stolen property, that's war. It's justice, Arceneaux replied. The kind of justice that doesn't exist in courtrooms, that can't be delivered by sheriffs who don't come into the basin, that only happens when men decide that some things are worth killing for. He paused, his gaze sweeping across his family. Are you with me? All of you? One by one, they nodded. The war was about to begin. The reconnaissance took 4 days. Arceneaux understood that rushing into a confrontation with armed men who had already demonstrated their willingness to operate outside the law, would be suicide. The Fontenots were skilled hunters, experienced with weapons, intimately familiar with the basin. But they were 6 men against an unknown number of opponents who had chosen this terrain specifically because it offered advantages to those who controlled it. They needed information. They needed to understand what they were facing. Gustave and Alcide handled the initial surveillance. They were the youngest, the most expendable in Arceneaux's cold calculation, but also the most capable of moving through the swamp without being detected. They had grown up learning to stalk deer and wild boar, to approach prey without disturbing a single blade of grass. Applying those skills to human targets was different in kind, but not in practice. They left before dawn on March 18th, taking one of the pirogues, a small, silent vessel that could navigate the shallow waters near Île Maudite without alerting anyone to their presence. They carried binoculars, a camera that Thibault had borrowed from a contact in Henderson, and enough food and water to sustain them for 3 days of observation. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Île Maudite was perhaps 30 acres of high ground in the middle of the basin, densely forested with cypress and tupelo, accessible only through a narrow channel that had been deliberately obscured with fallen trees and vegetation. Without local knowledge, without understanding exactly where to enter, a stranger would pass within 50 feet of the island and never know it existed. The traffickers had built a compound on the eastern side of the island, where the ground was highest and driest. Gustave counted 3 permanent structures, prefabricated buildings that had been brought in by boat and assembled on site, plus a dock where the stolen airboat was moored alongside 2 other vessels. And there were people, not just the traffickers, but their cargo. Through the binoculars, Gustave watched as women were led from one building to another. He counted at least 12, ranging in age from perhaps 16 to 40, their movements suggesting exhaustion and fear. Some wore clothing that seemed designed for a different climate, light dresses, sandals, garments suited for Central America rather than the Louisiana swamp. He photographed everything he could, hands shaking slightly as he documented evidence of something far worse than property theft. How many men? Alcide whispered, though they were far enough from the island that normal conversation wouldn't have been heard. I've counted 9 so far. There could be more inside the buildings. 9 against 6, and they've got our boat, which means they control the fastest way on and off the island. Getting the boat back has to be part of the plan. Without it, we can't extract anyone quickly. Alcide was quiet for a moment, watching the compound through his own binoculars. We're really going to do this, aren't we? Not just take back what's ours, but all of it. You heard Grand-Père. We can't know what we know and do nothing. These aren't deer, Gustave. They're people. Killing them, they're slavers. They're men who trade in human beings, who take women from their homes and sell them like livestock. Whatever we do to them, they've earned it. Alcide didn't respond. He had never killed a man, had never even considered the possibility until 4 days ago. Now he was preparing to participate in what would effectively be a massacre, an extermination of an entire criminal operation. He wondered if he would be the same person afterward. He suspected he wouldn't. Rémy Arceneaux's investigation led him to Henderson, a small town on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin that served as the gateway between the swamp and the outside world. Henderson had changed significantly since 1978. Where there had once been a handful of fishing camps and a single general store, there was now a tourism industry, restaurants serving crawfish étouffée and gumbo, airboat tour companies, a visitor center that explained the ecological significance of the basin to people who would never venture into it beyond the designated tourist routes. But beneath the commercial surface, the old community persisted. Families who had lived here for generations still fished and trapped, still maintained the connections and loyalties that had defined life in the basin for centuries. If anyone knew about events from 1978, they would be here. Rémy started at Pat's Fisherman's Wharf, a restaurant that had been operating since the 1940s and that served as an informal community center for the locals. He ordered boudin and coffee, let the waitress know that he was a journalist researching the history of the basin, and waited to see who might be interested in talking. The man who eventually sat down across from him was in his 70s, with the weathered face and calloused hands of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. "You're the reporter asking about the old days," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Rémy Arceneaux, and you are? Doesn't matter. What matters is what you're looking for, and whether you should be looking for it. I received some information about events in 1978, disappearances in the basin. I'm trying to understand what happened." The old man studied him for a long moment, his eyes carrying an assessment that Rémy recognized, the calculation of whether a stranger could be trusted. 1978 was a long time ago. Most of the people who knew anything about what happened back then are dead now. Most, but not all. No, not all. The man took a sip of the coffee that the waitress had brought without being asked. "You know about the Fontenots?" Rémy felt his pulse quicken. The letter hadn't mentioned any names, but he had suspected from the beginning that whatever happened in 1978 involved a local family. The basin wasn't a place where outsiders could operate without being noticed. "I know the name. Old family, lived deep in the basin. Beyond that, not much." They were trappeurs, guides, the real thing, not the tourist version. Their people had been in that swamp since before Louisiana was American. The old man paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. In the spring of '78, someone stole their airboat, most important piece of equipment they had. Without it, they couldn't work. What happened? Officially, nothing. The theft was never reported, never investigated. But over the next few months, men started disappearing. Men who weren't from around here, men who had been seen in the basin doing things that didn't involve fishing or hunting. By the time it was over, 14 of them had vanished. And the Fontenots got their boat back eventually. Never said how. Never said anything about the disappearances either. People knew better than to ask. "You're saying the Fontenots killed those men?" The old man's expression didn't change. "I'm saying that 14 men who shouldn't have been in the basin disappeared from the basin, and a family that had been wronged got their property back. What happened in between?" He shrugged. "The swamp keeps its secrets, always has." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone already told you enough to come looking, and because the truth about what happened in '78 isn't as simple as murder. Those men who disappeared, they weren't innocent. They were doing something in that swamp that needed to be stopped. The Fontenot stopped it." "What were they doing?" The old man finished his coffee and stood. "Find Gustave Fontenot. He's the only one left who can tell you the whole story, if he wants to tell it." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Mr. Arceneaux? Be careful what you dig up. Some graves are better left undisturbed." The attack on Île Maudite came on March 22, 1978. The Fontenot had spent the previous 2 days preparing, cleaning and loading weapons, memorizing the layout of the compound from Gustave's photographs, planning the approach that would give them the best chance of success. Aislinn had devised the strategy with the same methodical precision he applied to everything. Identify the objectives, anticipate the obstacles, eliminate variables that could lead to failure. The objectives were threefold: recover the airboat, neutralize the traffickers, and free their captives. Each objective complicated the others. They couldn't simply burn the compound to the ground with everyone inside, couldn't use tactics that might harm the women they were trying to rescue, couldn't afford to let any of the traffickers escape to bring reinforcements or report what had happened. They would have to do this carefully, surgically, and they would have to do it in a way that left no witnesses. The approach began at 3 a.m. when darkness was deepest and human alertness was at its lowest ebb. The Fontenots came in 3 boats, the borrowed flatboat, a pirogue, and a small aluminum john boat that Landry had retrieved from a cache on the family property. They navigated by memory and starlight, their motors cut, using paddles to move silently through water that reflected nothing but the vast indifference of the sky. Gustave led them to the concealed channel that provided access to the island, the route he had identified during his surveillance. They entered single file, moving so slowly that the water barely rippled around their hulls, every sense straining for any indication that they had been detected. The compound was quiet when they reached the island's shore. A single light burned in one of the prefabricated buildings, probably a guard station based on what Gustav had observed, but the rest of the structures were dark. Somewhere in the darkness, the women were sleeping, unaware that their fate was about to be decided by men they had never met. Aslan gathered his family in the shadows at the tree line, speaking in a whisper that was barely audible even to those standing next to him. Landry, Narcisse, you take the guard station, fast and quiet. No gunfire unless there's no other choice. And if there's more than one guard? Handle it! Alcide, Gustave, you secure the boat. Cut the fuel lines on the other vessels so they can't follow us. Don't start the engine until you hear me signal. What's the signal? You'll know it when you hear it. Asseline's eyes moved to his brother. Thibault, you're with me. We clear the main building, find whoever's in charge. I want answers before we're done tonight. What kind of answers? How many more operations like this one? Who they work for? Where the other women have been sent? Asseline's voice hardened. And then we end them, all of them. No survivors, no witnesses. When we're finished here, it'll be like this place never existed. The family dispersed into the darkness, each pair moving toward their assigned objective. Gustave felt his heart pounding as he and Alcido approached the dock where the airboat was moored. His grandfather's boat, the machine that Asselin had built with his own hands, that had carried the family through nearly a decade of work in the basin, was 20 feet away, stolen property about to be reclaimed. But recovering the boat seemed almost trivial now. What mattered was what came next. The first death occurred at 3:47 a.m. Landry and Narcisse reached the guard station to find 2 men inside, not one. Both were armed, both were awake, and both turned toward the door when it opened. Narcisse moved first. The knife he had carried since his 16th birthday, a blade forged by a blacksmith in Bro Bridge, designed for skinning alligators, found the first guard's throat before the man could raise his weapon. The spray of blood was immediate and arterial, painting the wall of the small building in a pattern that would never be cleaned because the building would never be found. The second guard managed to get his pistol halfway to firing position before Landry hit him with a wooden baton, a single blow to the temple that dropped him instantly. A second blow ensured he would never rise. 2 down. At least 7 more to go. The brothers moved quickly, dragging the bodies away from the doorway, checking the building for communication equipment that might have been used to alert others. They found a radio, switched off, its batteries removed, and placed in a charger on the desk. Either the traffickers felt confident in their isolation, or they were incompetent. Either way, it was an advantage the Fontenots would exploit. At the dock, Gustave and Alcide had reached the airboat without incident. Alcide cut the fuel lines on the other 2 vessels, while Gustave checked their grandfather's boat, confirming that it was intact and operational. The thieves had taken good care of it, probably because they recognized its value, understood that it was a tool worth maintaining. They would die having never used it again. The main building was where the women were kept. Asselin and Thibault approached it from the rear, moving along the exterior wall until they reached a window that offered a view into the interior. What they saw confirmed everything the surveillance had suggested. The building had been converted into a makeshift dormitory, rows of cots filling a space that might once have been intended for storage or equipment. The women were sleeping, perhaps 15 of them, their bodies curled into positions that suggested exhaustion and resignation. Armed guards were visible at both ends of the room, drowsing in chairs, their weapons resting across their laps. 2 guards inside, Thibault whispered, plus whoever else is in the other buildings. We clear this building first. The women are the priority. We can't risk them getting caught in crossfire. And after we sweep the rest of the compound. Anyone we find who isn't a captive dies. No exceptions. They entered through a door at the rear of the building, a service entrance that the guards weren't watching because they weren't expecting threats to come from within the compound. Asselin had spent 60 years hunting animals that could kill him with a single mistake. Moving silently through a dark room while men dozed in their chairs was not significantly more difficult. The first guard died without waking up. Aislin's knife opened his throat from behind, the blade so sharp that the man probably felt nothing before the blood loss dropped him from consciousness to death. Thibault handled the second guard with equal efficiency. A hand over the mouth, a knife across the throat. the universal equation of silence and blade. The women began to stir as the guards fell. One of them, older than the others, with gray in her hair and the bearing of someone who had been through things that would break most people, sat up and looked directly at Arsène, who was standing over a dead man with blood dripping from his hands. She didn't scream, didn't cry, simply looked at him with eyes that were assessing the situation, calculating whether this blood-covered stranger was another threat or something else. "¿Quién es usted?" she asked. "Who are you?" "Alguien que va a sacarlas de aquí," Arsène replied. His Spanish was imperfect, learned from workers he had hired over the years, but it was comprehensible. "Someone who's going to get you out of here. Los hombres? Muertos, o lo serán pronto." The woman nodded slowly, then turned to the others, who were now awake and watching with expressions that ranged from terror to desperate hope. She spoke to them rapidly in Spanish, explaining, Arsène assumed, that the situation had changed, that the men who had been holding them were being eliminated, that they might survive this after all. "Stay here," Arsène told her. "Stay quiet. Don't leave this building until I come back for you." "How will we know it's safe? When there's no one left alive to hurt you, it'll be safe." He left her with that promise, rejoining T-Bolt outside, where the night was still dark and the work was far from finished. The killing continued for another hour. The Fontenots moved through the compound with the systematic efficiency of men who understood that hesitation meant death. They cleared each building, eliminated each target, gathered the bodies in a pile near the center of the island where they could be dealt with after the operation was complete. Some of the traffickers fought back. 3 of them managed to reach weapons, to fire shots that shattered the silence of the swamp and sent night birds screaming into the sky. But the Fontenots had position, had surprise, had the advantage of men defending home and family against men defending nothing but profit. Narcisse took a bullet in the left arm during one exchange, a through and through that bled heavily but hadn't hit bone. He bound it with a strip of cloth torn from a dead man's shirt and kept fighting, the pain a distant thing compared to the urgency of the task. By 5 a.m. it was over. 14 men lay dead on Île Maudite. Some had been traffickers, organizers of the operation. Others had been hired muscle, guards brought in to protect the cargo and the compound. A few had been drivers, transporters whose job was to move the women from the island to their final destinations. All of them had been complicit. All of them had known what they were doing, and all of them had paid the price that the Fontenot believed such crimes deserved. The women, 17 in total, not 15 as Gustave had initially estimated, were gathered in the main building, watched over by Thibault, while the others completed the cleanup. They were from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, women who had been promised jobs in America and had found themselves prisoners instead. Arsène stood among the bodies, looking at the faces of men who had stolen his airboat, who had used his swamp as a corridor for human misery, who had thought they could operate in Fontenot territory without consequences. They had been wrong. "What do we do with them?" Landry asked, indicating the dead. "We can't leave them here. The swamp will take them. We weight the bodies, sink them in deep water. Different locations, different parts of the basin. Let the gators and the fish do the rest." "And the women?" Arsène looked toward the building, where 17 victims of a trade as old as human cruelty were waiting to learn what would happen next. "We take them out of the basin, drop them somewhere they can find help, somewhere they can contact authorities. We don't tell them who we are, and we don't let them see our faces clearly. They've already seen us. They've seen men in the dark. They've seen shadows that killed their captors and set them free. That's all they need to remember. And if they talk, who would believe them? 17 illegal immigrants claiming that swamp dwellers massacred their guards and set them free. The authorities will think they escaped on their own, that the traffickers killed each other, that the basin swallowed the evidence like it swallows everything else." Landry nodded slowly. It was a plan that relied on the swamp's reputation, on the incredulity of outsiders, on the silence that the Fontenots had maintained for 7 generations. "Let's get to work," Arsène said. "We've got a lot of bodies to move, and the sun will be up soon." The bodies took 3 days to dispose of. Arsène had been specific about the methodology. No mass grave, no single location that might be discovered, no pattern that could be discerned by anyone who came looking. Each of the 14 men would be buried separately in different parts of the basin, weighted with chains and concrete blocks salvaged from the compound. sunk in waters deep enough that even the worst drought wouldn't expose them. The family worked in shifts, rotating between body disposal and caring for the women they had rescued. The women stayed in the main building on Île Maudite, while the Fontenots systematically erased every trace of what had happened there, burning documents, dismantling equipment, scuttling the remaining boats in deep water. Gustave handled much of the transportation, piloting the recovered airboat through channels he had known since childhood, carrying wrapped corpses to locations that only the Fontenots would ever be able to find. Each trip felt different from the last, the weight of what he was doing accumulating in ways he hadn't anticipated. The first body had been almost abstract, a problem to be solved, a task to be completed. By the 7th, he had started seeing the faces in his sleep. By the 14th, he understood that he would see them for the rest of his life. "You're quiet," Alcide observed during a rare moment of rest between trips. They were sitting on the dock at Île Maudite, watching the sun set through cypress trees that had witnessed things that would never be spoken of again. "Just thinking about what we did, about what we're still doing, about what it means." Alcide was quiet for a moment. He had been struggling with the same questions, the same doubts, the same late-night reckonings that came when the adrenaline faded and the reality of 14 deaths settled into consciousness. "Grandpère says we did what was necessary, that those men were evil, that they deserved what they got. Do you believe that? I believe that the women in that building would have been sold like animals if we hadn't stopped it. I believe that men who trade in human beings forfeit the right to be treated as human themselves." Alcide paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I also believe that killing changes you, that we're not the same people we were before we came to this island, and I don't know if that change is something we can ever undo." Gustave nodded slowly. It was the most honest conversation they had ever had, more honest than the years of working together, of learning the family trade, of preparing for a future that neither of them had imagined would include murder. "The women," Gustave said, "what happens to them?" "Papa and the uncles are working on that. They're going to take them to Lafayette, drop them near a church that helps immigrants. Let them find their own way from there. They'll talk. They'll tell someone what happened. They'll tell someone that men in the swamp killed their captors and set them free. They won't have names, won't have faces they can identify clearly, won't have any evidence that leads back to us. And who's going to believe them anyway? Illegal immigrants claiming that Cajun vigilantes massacred 14 traffickers and rescued them from slavery? The authorities might believe them. The authorities would have to find this island first, would have to find the bodies, would have to connect a theft that was never reported to a massacre that officially never happened. Alcide shook his head. "We're ghosts, cousin. We don't exist unless we want to exist. And after tonight, this place doesn't exist either." Rémy Arceneaux found Gustave Fontenot on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2017. The old man lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Henderson, a modest structure that looked like it had been built in the 1960s and hadn't been significantly updated since. The yard was well maintained, the kind of careful tidiness that suggested someone with time on his hands and habits too ingrained to abandon. Rémy had spent 3 months tracking him down, following threads that led from the anonymous letter through the archives of the St. Martin Parish Library and the memories of old-timers who still remembered the Fontenot family. Most of those old-timers had refused to speak beyond vague references and meaningful silences. But eventually, someone had given him a name and an address, along with a warning. "Gustave doesn't talk about the old days. Don't expect him to start now." Rémy knocked on the door and waited. The man who answered was 64 years old, but he looked older, weathered by decades of sun and wind, his hands still carrying the scars of a life spent working with traps and knives and equipment that didn't forgive mistakes. His eyes were what struck Rémy most, pale blue, almost colorless, carrying a wariness that suggested long experience with people who came asking questions. "Gustave Fontenot? Who's asking?" "My name is Rémy Arceneaux. I'm a journalist. I received a letter a few months ago, and I've been investigating what it described. I think you might be able to help me understand what happened." Gustave studied him for a long moment, his expression revealing nothing. "What letter?" Rémy reached into his pocket and produced the envelope, now worn from handling. He held it out so Gustave could see the handwriting, the postmark, the physical evidence of an anonymous communication that had set everything in motion. Something flickered in Gustav's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. "You'd better come inside," he said. The interior of the house was sparse but clean. Photographs lined one wall, generations of Fontenots, Rémy assumed, dating back to the black and white era and continuing through to color prints that looked like they might be from the 1990s. A crucifix hung above the doorway to the kitchen, and a rosary was draped over a lamp near the window. Gustave gestured to a chair and took a seat across from Rémy, his movements carrying the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had started to betray him. "That letter," he said. "You know who sent it?" "I assumed you did, or someone in your family." "My family is dead. I'm the last one." Gustave's voice was flat, matter of fact. "My father Narcisse died in 1994, Uncle Landry in 1999. Grand-père Asselin went in 2001, 93 years old. Uncle Thibault followed him 6 months later. And my cousin Alcide—" He paused, something shifting behind his eyes. "Alcide died in 2015, cancer. He was 67. I'm sorry. Don't be. We all die eventually. The question is what we do before we die, and whether we can live with it." Gustave's gaze found the envelope in Rémy's hands. "I didn't send that letter, but I know who did." "Who?" "Alcide. He wrote it before he died, gave it to someone with instructions to mail it after enough time had passed. He wanted the truth to come out, but he didn't want it to come out while any of us were still alive to face consequences. Why wait until now? Because I was still alive. Because he thought I deserved to have my peace, even if he couldn't have his own." Gustave shook his head slowly. "He was wrong about that. I haven't had peace since 1978. I don't expect I ever will." Rémy leaned forward, sensing that he was on the edge of something, that the old man was preparing to unburden himself of secrets that had been carried for nearly 4 decades. "Mr. Fontenot, I've spent months researching what happened in 1978. I know about the disappearances, 14 men who went into the basin and never came out. I know about the stolen airboat, about your family's reputation, about the rumors that have circulated ever since. What I don't know is the truth, and I think you're the only person left who can tell me." Gustave was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, carrying the weight of memories that had never faded. "What do you think you know? I think your family killed those men. I think they did it to recover stolen property and to punish the people who had wronged them. That's part of it, but only part." Gustave stood, moving to the window, looking out at a landscape that bore no resemblance to the swamp where everything had happened. "Those 14 men, they weren't just thieves, they were monsters. And what we did to them wasn't murder, it was justice." "What were they doing?" "Trafficking, human beings, women mostly, bringing them through the basin to avoid detection, holding them on an island in the middle of nowhere, moving them to buyers who would use them as slaves. We found 17 of them when we took the island back. 17 women from Central America who had been promised a better life and had found something worse than death." Rémy felt his understanding of the story shift, the moral calculus becoming more complex than simple revenge. "You freed them?" "We killed the men who were holding them, and we freed them. Took them to a place where they could find help, disappeared back into the swamp, let the world think that the traffickers had simply vanished. And the bodies? The basin keeps its secrets. Those men are still out there, somewhere, scattered across 1,000,000 acres of water and mud. They'll never be found. They don't deserve to be found." The conversation continued for hours. Gustave told Rémy everything. The discovery of the theft, the reconnaissance, the attack on Île Maudite, the methodical disposal of 14 bodies across the Atchafalaya Basin. He described the faces of the women they had rescued, the fear and hope and disbelief that had mixed in their eyes when they realized they were being freed rather than sold. He described the aftermath too, the decades of silence, the weight that each member of the family had carried in their own way, how Asselin had become more religious in his final years, attending Mass every day, seeking absolution for sins that no priest could properly comprehend, how Thibault had stopped speaking about the past entirely, sealing away memories that were too painful to examine, how Landry and Narcisse had thrown themselves into work, into family, into anything that might distract them from what they had done, and how Alcide, the cousin who had been closest to Gustave, the young man who had helped him recover the airboat while others were killing, had never recovered. He saw things that night that broke something inside him, Gustav said. Not the killing itself, though that was bad enough. It was afterward, when we were cleaning up, when we found evidence of what those men had done to the women before we arrived. Things I won't describe, things that human beings shouldn't do to other human beings. Alcide saw all of it, and he couldn't unsee it. What happened to him? He drank. For years he drank to forget. And when drinking stopped working, he just withdrew, stopped talking to people, stopped leaving his house, stopped living in any meaningful sense. By the time the cancer took him, I think he was relieved. I think he'd been waiting to die for a long time. And you? Gustav turned from the window, his pale eyes meeting Rémy's. I've spent 39 years trying to understand what we did, whether it was right, whether it was wrong, whether those categories even apply to something like what happened on that island. I've prayed about it, confessed it to priests who didn't know whether to absolve me or turn me in, lain awake at night with the faces of dead men floating behind my eyes. Have you reached any conclusions? I've reached the conclusion that some questions don't have answers, that sometimes you do what you do because there's no other choice, because the alternative is worse, because men who trade in human beings need to be stopped, and nobody else was going to stop them. Was it murder? Legally, yes. Morally? He shrugged. I'll find out when I die, I suppose, when I face whatever judgment is waiting. The women had been transported to Lafayette on March 25, 1978. Aislinn had handled the logistics personally, wanting to ensure that the final phase of the operation went as smoothly as the assault itself. They had loaded the 17 women into boats, navigated out of the basin under cover of darkness, transferred them to a truck that Thibault had arranged to be waiting at a landing near Henderson. The drive to Lafayette had taken 2 hours. Aislinn and Thibault had dropped the women near the Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist, a place where they knew help would be available, where questions would be asked, but answers wouldn't be demanded. They had given the oldest woman, the one who had first spoken to Aislinn on the island, enough money to get the group started, along with a warning. Don't tell anyone who helped you. Don't describe us. Don't try to find us. Don't mention the island or what happened there. As far as you know, you escaped on your own, found your way out of the swamp, made it to safety through luck and determination. That's the story. The only story. The woman had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that understood the cost of the freedom she had been given. "Por qué?" she asked. "Why?" "Because they stole from us," Aislinn replied. "And because some things are wrong no matter who does them. Go now, find a new life, and forget that we ever existed." They had driven away without looking back, returning to the basin, to the cleanup that would take another 2 days to complete, to the silence that would define the rest of their lives. The women had done as instructed. Over the following weeks, they had dispersed, some staying in Louisiana, others making their way to Texas or California or back to Central America. They had told their stories to authorities, to social workers, to anyone who would listen. But those stories had been fragmented, contradictory, lacking the specific details that would have allowed an investigation to proceed. The official conclusion was that the trafficking operation had collapsed due to internal conflicts, that the perpetrators had killed each other or fled, that the victims had somehow escaped during the chaos. It was a convenient explanation, one that required no further inquiry, one that allowed the case to be closed and forgotten. Only the Fontenots knew the truth, and they had kept that truth buried as deeply as the bodies they had scattered across the Atchafalaya. "Why are you telling me this?" Rémy asked, as evening settled over Henderson and the light in Gustav's living room grew dim. "You've kept this secret for nearly 40 years. Why break your silence now?" "Because Alcide wanted it broken. Because he sent that letter knowing that eventually someone would find me, would ask the questions you're asking. He believed the truth should be known, even if knowing it doesn't change anything." "And you? What do you believe?" Gustav was quiet for a long moment. "I believe that 17 women are alive today who would have been destroyed if we hadn't done what we did. I believe that the men we killed would have gone on killing, would have trafficked more victims, would have continued to profit from human misery until someone stopped them. And I believe that the law, the official law, the courts and sheriffs and federal agents would never have stopped them, not in time, not before more people suffered. So, you believe it was justified?" I believe it was necessary. Justified is a word for philosophers and priests. Necessary is a word for men who have to make decisions when there are no good options, only less bad ones. Gustave's eyes found Rémy's, held them. What are you going to do with what I've told you? It was the question Rémy had been asking himself. Throughout the conversation, the question that would determine whether he was a journalist or something else. I don't know, he admitted. It's not what I expected to find. I came here looking for a story about murder, about vigilante justice, about a family that took revenge for a stolen boat. What you've described is something else entirely. It's both. It's revenge and rescue, murder and liberation. It's complicated in ways that don't fit into newspaper articles or legal categories. Gustave stood, his movement stiff with age and exhaustion. You'll have to decide for yourself what to do with the truth. But I'll ask you one thing. What? Think about the women. Think about what would have happened to them if we hadn't acted. Think about the lives they've lived since 1978, the families they have raised, the children and grandchildren who exist, because 17 women were freed from an island in the swamp, and then decide whether the world needs to know how that freedom was purchased. Rémy left Gustave Fontenot's house as night fell over Henderson, his recorder full of testimony that could reshape the understanding of events that had occurred before he was born. He had a story. The question was whether it was a story that should be told. Rémy Arceneaux didn't sleep that night. He sat in his car outside Gustave Fontenot's house for nearly an hour after leaving, staring at the recorder in his hands, thinking about the weight of what it contained. 39 years of silence, broken in a single afternoon. 14 deaths explained, 17 lives saved, and a question that had no easy answer. What was he supposed to do with the truth? He was a journalist. His entire career had been built on the principle that truth mattered, that the public had a right to know what happened in their communities, that sunlight was the best disinfectant for the dark corners where secrets festered. He had exposed corruption, revealed scandals, held powerful people accountable for their actions. That was his job. That was his purpose. But this was different. The men who had died on Île Maudite weren't victims in any meaningful sense. They were traffickers, slavers, men who had built a business on human suffering. Their deaths hadn't created widows who deserved closure or orphans who needed to understand what happened to their fathers. Their deaths had freed 17 women from a fate worse than anything the legal system could have imposed on their captors. And the men who had killed them, the Fontenots, the family that had lived in the basin for 7 generations, they weren't criminals in the way that word was usually understood. They had acted to recover stolen property, yes, but they had also acted to stop an atrocity that no one else was positioned to stop, that would have continued indefinitely if 6 Cajun trappers hadn't decided that some things were worth killing for. Was that murder? Legally, unquestionably. Morally, Rémy wasn't sure anymore. He drove home as the sun rose over St. Martin Parish, the recorder sitting on the passenger seat like an unexploded bomb. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of Rémy's professional life. He transcribed Gustave's testimony, verified what details he could through independent research, constructed a narrative that connected the anonymous letter to the events of 1978, to the old man living alone in Henderson. The story was complete, documented, ready for publication. And he couldn't bring himself to publish it. Every time he sat down to write the article, he found himself thinking about the women, about the lives they had lived since 1978, the families they had raised, the children and grandchildren who existed because 6 men had decided to act when no one else would. Publishing the story wouldn't bring justice. Everyone involved was dead except Gustave, and Gustave was 64 years old, living out his final years with memories that already punished him more than any court could. What would publication accomplish? It would satisfy curiosity, certainly. It would close a historical mystery, provide answers to questions that a few people had been asking for nearly 4 decades. It would make Rémy's reputation, establish him as the journalist who had finally cracked the Fontenot case. But it would also expose Gustave to scrutiny he didn't deserve. It would drag the memory of his family through public judgment by people who hadn't been there, who couldn't understand the context, who would reduce a complex moral situation to simple categories of guilt and innocence. And it would potentially identify the women, or at least draw attention to them, to their existence, to the fact that somewhere in America or Central America, 17 survivors of human trafficking were living lives that had been made possible by murder. Rémy made his decision in November 2017, 2 months after his conversation with Gustave. He drove back to Henderson, knocked on the same door, sat in the same chair across from the same old man who had unburdened himself of secrets that had been carried for a lifetime. "I'm not going to publish," he said. Gustave's expression didn't change. He had been expecting this visit, Rémy realized. Had probably been expecting it since the moment Rémy left his house. Why? Because publication wouldn't serve justice. The men you killed deserved what they got. I believe that now, even if I couldn't have believed it before I heard the full story. And exposing what happened wouldn't help anyone. It would just satisfy curiosity at the expense of people who have suffered enough. That's not the decision most journalists would make. Maybe not, but I'm not most journalists. Rémy reached into his bag and produced the recorder, the transcripts, the notes he had compiled over months of investigation. "I'm giving this to you, everything I have. Do whatever you want with it. Destroy it, keep it, pass it on to someone else. It's your story. You should decide what happens to it." Gustave looked at the materials Rémy was offering, his pale eyes unreadable. "Why?" "Because you've carried this long enough. Because your cousin wanted the truth to be known, but you're the one who has to live with the consequences of that knowing. And because..." Rémy paused, searching for words that could express something he was only beginning to understand. "Because some stories don't belong to the public. Some stories belong only to the people who live them." Gustave was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that he had spent decades learning to suppress. "You're a strange man, Rémy Arceneaux." "So I've been told. My cousin Alcide, he sent that letter because he thought the world needed to know what we did. He thought there was something noble in it, something that deserved to be remembered. But I always disagreed. I always thought that what we did should die with us, should vanish into the swamp the way those bodies vanished. And now? Now I think maybe you're right. Maybe some truths are better kept than told. Maybe the best memorial for what happened in 1978 is the lives that were saved, not a story in a newspaper." He took the materials from Rémy's hands, held them for a moment, as if weighing not just their physical mass, but their significance. "What will you do?" Rémy asked. "Burn them, probably. Let the fire have what the swamp couldn't take." Gustave paused, something shifting in his expression. "But first, would you like to see it? The place where it happened? Il maudit! It doesn't exist anymore. Not the compound, anyway. We burned everything, dismantled what wouldn't burn, let the swamp reclaim what was left. But the island is still there. The land remembers, even if nothing else does." Rémy hesitated. He had told himself he was done with this story, that giving up his materials meant giving up his connection to events that had happened before he was born. But the offer was too significant to refuse. A chance to see the place where 14 men had died and 17 women had been freed, to stand on ground that had witnessed something that would never be officially acknowledged. "Yes," he said. "I'd like that." They went the next morning. Gustave still owned a boat, a small aluminum vessel with an outboard motor, nothing like the airboat that had started everything, but capable of navigating the calmer waters of the basin. They launched from a private dock outside Henderson, entered the swamp as the sun was rising, traveled deeper into the Atchafalaya than Rémy had ever been. The basin was beautiful in a way that photographs couldn't capture. Cypress trees rose from water that reflected the sky like dark mirrors. Spanish moss hung in curtains that filtered the light into something soft and eternal. Birds called from branches that had been old when Louisiana was still French, and somewhere in the distance, an alligator slid into the water with barely a ripple. "I forget sometimes," Gustave said, his voice carrying across the quiet water. "I forget how much I love this place, how much my family loved it, how much we sacrificed to stay here when everyone else was leaving for the cities." "Why did you leave?" "I didn't leave the basin. I left the deep swamp, the place where my family had lived for 150 years. After the others died, after I was the only one left, I couldn't stay there anymore. Too many ghosts, too many memories in every tree and every channel. Where is it? The family land? About 10 miles from here. Still owned by the family, by me, I suppose, since I'm the only family left. I pay the taxes, keep it legally protected, but I haven't been there in years, couldn't bear it. They traveled in silence for a while, the only sounds the motor's steady hum and the calls of birds disturbed by their passage. Rémy watched the landscape change as they moved deeper into the basin, the trees growing thicker, the channels narrowing, the sense of civilization receding until it felt like they had traveled not just miles, but centuries. There, Gustave said finally, pointing to a mass of vegetation that looked no different from any other part of the swamp. Rémy looked, but saw nothing, just cypress and tupelo, just water and mud, just the endless green sameness that characterized the basin. I don't see anything. That's the point. That's what we wanted. Gustave cut the motor, letting the boat drift on its own momentum. The channel that leads to the island is completely overgrown now. You'd have to know exactly where it is to find it, and even then you'd need tools to cut through. The swamp has taken it back. And the compound? Gone. We burned what we could, buried what we couldn't, let nature do the rest. There's nothing left, no buildings, no equipment, no evidence that anyone was ever there. Just an island that nobody visits, in a part of the basin that nobody explores. The bodies? Scattered, 14 different locations, none of them close to each other, all of them in water deep enough that even drought wouldn't expose them. The chains and concrete we use should keep them down forever, and even if they somehow surfaced, Gustave shrugged. The gators and the fish have had 40 years. There wouldn't be anything left to identify. Rémy stared at the impenetrable vegetation, trying to imagine what lay beyond it. A clearing, perhaps, where prefabricated buildings had once stood, where women had been held captive, where 14 men had died in a single night. It seemed impossible that something so significant could leave so little trace. But that was the nature of the swamp. It swallowed everything eventually, bodies, buildings, secrets, sins. It had been doing so for thousands of years, and it would continue doing so long after everyone who remembered 1978 was gone. Thank you, Rémy said, for showing me this, for trusting me with the story, even if it won't be told. Thank you for not telling it, for understanding that some things are better left in the dark. Gustave started the motor again, began turning the boat back toward Henderson. And for letting an old man unburden himself before he dies. That's worth more than you know. Gustave Fontenot died on February 3rd, 2019. He was 65 years old, the last of a family that had lived in the Atchafalaya Basin since before Louisiana was a state. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but Rémy suspected it was something else, the weight of secrets finally becoming too heavy to carry, the body surrendering to what the mind had been struggling with for 4 decades. The funeral was small. Gustave had outlived everyone who might have mourned him. No wife, no children, no siblings or cousins or nieces or nephews. The priest who conducted the service had known him only from occasional appearances at Mass, and the few attendees were neighbors who had recognized a lonely old man without understanding anything about his history. Rémy attended, standing at the back of the church, watching as the final Fontenot was committed to God's mercy. He had kept his promise, had never published the story, had never spoken of what Gustave had told him, had let the silence of 4 decades continue unbroken. But he had never forgotten either. After the service, after the burial in a cemetery that held no other Fontenots, Rémy walked to his car and found an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in the trembling script of an old man whose strength was failing. Mr. Arceneaux, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I asked my attorney to deliver this after my funeral to make sure you received it. I want to thank you again for what you did, for listening, for understanding, for choosing silence when silence was the kindest option. You gave me something I didn't expect to find at the end of my life, peace, or something close to it. I've left instructions for my property to be donated to the state as a wildlife preserve. The family land, the 40 acres where my grandfather was born and where I learned to trap and fish and navigate the basin, it will be protected now, forever. No one will ever build there, ever dig there, ever disturb what remains of a way of life that the world has moved beyond. And Île Maudite will stay hidden. The channel will keep growing over, the buildings will keep rotting into the earth, and the 14 men we buried there will keep their appointment with eternity. Maybe that's justice. Maybe it's just the swamp being the swamp. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that we did the right thing in 1978. Not the legal thing, not the thing that society would have approved of, but the right thing. We stopped monsters, freed innocents, and accepted the consequences of acting when no one else would. If there's a God, and I've spent my whole life believing there is, I hope he understands. I hope he sees the 17 women we saved and weighs them against the 14 men we killed. And if he doesn't understand, if the judgment goes against us, then I'll accept that too. We knew what we were doing. We knew the risks. And we did it anyway because some things matter more than safety, more than law, more than the approval of people who have never had to make choices like the ones we made. Thank you, Rémy, for everything. Gustave Fontenot. Rémy read the letter 3 times, standing in the cemetery parking lot while winter wind blew through the live oaks and the world continued on without the last of the Fontenots. Then he folded the paper carefully, placed it in his wallet, and drove home. The story was never published. Rémy retired from journalism in 2021 at 58 years old, citing burnout and a desire to spend more time with his grandchildren. His colleagues threw him a party, gave him a plaque, made speeches about his contributions to Louisiana journalism. None of them knew about the biggest story he had ever found, the story he had chosen to bury rather than bring into the light. He thought about it sometimes, in the quiet moments when memory asserted itself, about Gustave and his pale blue eyes, about the weight of secrets carried across decades, about 14 men who had deserved to die, and 17 women who had deserved to live, about the swamp that kept its secrets, that swallowed evidence and memory and sin with equal indifference. He never returned to the Atchafalaya, never tried to find Il Maudit, never sought out the locations where the bodies had been hidden, never attempted to verify any part of the story he had been told. Some truths, he had come to understand, were not meant to be pursued to their conclusions. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. The Fontenot family land became a wildlife preserve in 2020, administered by the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. It was named the Fontenot Wildlife Management Area, a small tribute to a family that had lived there for 7 generations and had left behind nothing but land and silence. The preserve is open to the public now, accessible by boat during certain seasons, a destination for birdwatchers and photographers who come to capture the beauty of the Atchafalaya without knowing anything about its history. They paddle through channels that Gustave navigated as a child, pass within miles of an island where 14 men died and 17 women were freed, and return home with pictures and memories that contain no trace of what happened in 1978. The swamp keeps its secrets. It always has. Somewhere in the depths of the basin, beneath water that has cycled through evaporation and rain countless times since 1978, 14 sets of remains rest in the mud. Chains and concrete hold them down. Time and decay have erased their features, and the fish and the gators have done their work. They are part of the swamp now, as much a component of the ecosystem as the cypress roots and the Spanish moss and the dark water that covers everything. They will never be found. They don't deserve to be found. And the women they once held captive, the 17 survivors who walked out of the basin in March 1978, they are scattered now across the Americas, living lives that were made possible by violence. Some have died of old age. Some have grandchildren who have never heard the story of how their grandmother was rescued from an island in Louisiana by men who appeared from the darkness and killed everyone who stood between her and freedom. Some truths are passed down through generations, becoming family legends that grow more distant with each telling. Others are buried with the people who lived them, taking their secrets to graves that may or may not be marked. The truth of what happened on Il Maudit in 1978 belongs to the second category now. Gustave is dead. Alcide is dead. Asselin, Thibault, Landry, Narcisse, all dead, all silent, all beyond the reach of questions or consequences. Only the swamp remembers, only the water and the trees and the birds that witness things they couldn't understand. And the swamp isn't talking.